Hi, welcome to This is Getting Old. I'm your host, Melissa B., PhD, and today I'm joined by Cindy Cox Roman, and we're going to be talking about older women and personal agency. So, welcome, Cindy.
Thank you, Melissa. Great to be here.
So, maybe just tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll jump in to talking about older women and personal agency.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I am a market researcher, a gerontologist, and the founder of my own business called WIT Consulting. I've spent my career at the intersection of public policy, public opinion, and strategic communications. But a number of years ago, working for big global ad agencies, I became aware of to what extent older people are marginalized in society, and certainly by the companies that I was working with. So kind of plays out in a very specific way. Working, say, in research, older people are often excluded from surveys, so their opinions are not included when marketers are trying to understand what to do with the information, how to market them, etc. The reason why they're not included is because their views aren't considered to be that important. There's always a lot of focus on younger and middle-aged consumers, etc. So that disturbed me, and I wanted to understand more about the role of older people in society. And so I went back to get my master's in gerontology and became very interested in the idea of personal agency, which is how older people see themselves and their own hand in the present and future of their lives. So that's where I am today.
Okay. So when you say older, well, first of all, let's just define personal agency. That's not a term I think that we walk around using, but we are kind of in the middle of coronavirus, so I think a lot of people can probably relate to what this topic is about.
Yeah, in fact, there's probably no more important concept right now than personal agency when it comes to coronavirus. So it is a term that is used more by academics, by sociologists, but it's a very familiar concept. Personal agency is the idea of having a hand, believing that you have a hand in the direction that your life takes. We can think about it as having self-determination, as being self-sufficient. It's being your own white knight, being your own rescuer, being your own agent. I mean, when you think about agency, it's really, you can think about the idea of an agent. People hire an agent to be an advocate for themselves, to put their best into, look after their best interests. When you have personal agency, you are your own agent, literally acting in that way. It's the opposite of being passive, of letting the winds and whims of other people determine your future, and which can lead to a feeling of why bother. So personal agency is it's very important to who we are as human beings.
Yeah, so it's kind of like being in the driver's seat of your own life.
Absolutely.
And when you say older, like define what older women are.
Yeah, so typically older women are defined as women 60 plus. It could be 50 plus, but that really goes up to any age. And of course, older women are not a homogeneous group. You know, women who are in their 50s and 60s can be quite different because of the life course and where they're at, from women in their 70s and 80s or 90s and into their hundreds. So there are very distinct stages within that, but that's the group. I'm looking at sort of 60 plus versus under that.
Okay. Um, so why is personal agency important and how might it vary? Yeah, when I hear kind of the age groups, to me, that means it's kind of like a cohort. Every 10 years is like a cohort. So why is it important and how is it different at each of those stages?
Yeah, so personal agency is really important because if we don't have agency, then we don't ever realize our dreams. We are buffeted about by life and don't develop the feelings of self-efficacy and self-control and confidence that emanate. So agency kind of creates a virtuous cycle. You need to gain a sense of agency, which should happen as a child. I mean, infants have agency. We all have agency until our last breath. We can have agency, but you need to learn how to use your agency, practice your agency, and hold onto your agency for dear life. Now, what happens is that as people get older, they tend to live, and your metaphor of being in the driver's seat is right on, because that's actually a term that is typically used because people don't know they don't use the terms personal agency. So when we do research, we say, to what extent do you feel like you're in the driver's seat of your life? The research that I've been conducting independently, as well as other academic scholarly research, shows that agency tends to peak when women and men are in their 50s, and it declines after that. So you see a steady decline in the percentage of women, and I'm focused more on women in my research, who agree with the statement, who strongly agree with the statement, I'm in the driver's seat of my life. So, for example, 54% of women 45 to 54 years of age strongly agree with that statement, and that declines to about 33% of women 75 to 84. So the question is why? And I'm happy to talk more about that.
Right. So that was actually my next question.
Yeah. So we know that there's a number of factors, and I'll get back to your question about how it varies by age group. But you can sort of imagine how the trajectory goes. Health issues are a big factor, right? If you have a fracture and you need someone to, you've broken your leg and you can't get to the store, you lose a sense of having control over your life. You lose a sense of being in the driver's seat because you're now depending on other people. Financial issues can play a big part. Now, I want to be clear too that not everyone, for example, who has health issues or financial issues or all the things I mentioned doesn't have agency, because the key is that you can have agency in any situation. But these things can test one's sense of confidence and their ability to have agency. So financial issues. When you're older, if you have a fixed income, you can't maybe do the things that you would like to do. You can't treat your family to the vacation that somebody else might be taking their grandchildren on, et cetera. So it might decrease your sense of personal agency. Unfortunately, ageism and age discrimination is a big factor. So if you can't get a job when you're in your 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and you still want to work, that diminishes your sense of being in the driver's seat. That's just the way it is. What I am particularly interested in though, are the social and cultural aspects of why we lose agency. So I'm going to just talk for a minute about that, and then we can go on from there. But women born in the 1950s and before, so we're talking about women who are maybe in their late 50s, turning 60 and older now, up to 100 years old or 105, we were not socialized to have agency. In fact, it was pretty much the opposite. We were socialized to be deferential, to get married and have the man be the head of the household, to not ask for much, to not have too strong an opinion. It's just the way that things were because of the cultural norms. Now, what happened is those women grew up and they gained agency. They did a fantastic job raising a family. They may have started a business. They may have done other things. Think about women who worked in the war. I'm about to read the book Code Girls, women who were out there doing things, and that continues. Certainly baby boomer women were out there. There may have been a slight sense of inauthenticity because, unlike men, if you're not told that you can do it, that you have a hand in your future, that you don't need to defer to others, there can always be that sense of, gee, maybe somebody really is going to, maybe some women want a man to rescue them, or you expect that someone's going to ultimately save you. These are just the realities. There's a great book called The Cinderella Complex that dealt with women's hidden fear of independence. But the fact is you gain agency, but then just at the point where you may have really cemented that sense of agency, where you can have the confidence and sense of control, society begins to chip away at it. They say, let's say when you're like in your early 60s and society says, okay, it's time to retire. You should become a warm, cuddly grandmother. You shouldn't be out there thinking boldly about what you're going to be doing for the rest of your life. You shouldn't be thinking about how you're going to be the architect of your own future. You shouldn't be thinking about sort of how you can make your mark. You're supposed to be with your grandkids, and you're supposed to be warm and compliant and all those things that everybody loves. And there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is when society tells you that that is what you need to do. So all these messages suggest that having agency, it gives people less opportunity to practice agency. And without a lot of role models, although there are some great ones, all these forces sort of conspire to take agency away from people as they age.
Yeah. So there's actually a magazine that I was looking at this weekend, and it was featuring plastic surgeons and the number of people having kind of minor plastic surgery in order to appear more professional. And the quote was, there's so much ageism in the world, in the workplace. And you think about the differences in the way women age and how society views that compared to men. So all of the beauty products have like vitamin C, anti-aging, like all of those things. But there is a gender difference as you get older, that plays into that.
Yes. There's a big gender difference with agency from the start. So men in our culture are socialized to have agency. So the same men who were born in the 1950s and before and continue to be born, it's almost their birthright in our country and pretty much around the world. Men are expected to be in the driver's seat. They're expected to make the decisions. They're expected to have a strong hand in the direction that their life takes. Absolutely. Now, when they get older, the same thing happens. Society takes away some of their agency from them. They're also expected to go play golf, or they're expected to sort of sit around and, play bridge or do whatever. It's just our societal expectations of older people. But men are given more slack. They are certainly don't have the same rigid expectations of what you should be like when you're older. But the same issues of taking control away from an older person impact men as well as women. Nobody wants it. Nobody likes it.
Right. So I think some of the things I was thinking about as you were talking, there are these milestones that you meet coming into childhood, and there's this expectation that you're born and this is what you're going to do. But as we age, there's so much diversity that I don't think that's how people think about it. And then how does your own concept of what aging should look like? How does that play into this?
My own?
Yeah, because I could have a great, I can have a very different perception of what it's going to be like for me to age compared to like my whole peer group. I already do have a whole different attitude about it. So.
Yeah. Well, you find that a lot of people who get interested in the field of aging had a powerful parent or grandparent in their life that shaped that view. Think often a grandparent. So my own grandmother on my father's side worked until she was 85, and she lived to 104, and she was very active up until she was about 102. She had a strong sense of agency. I didn't actually realize what it was, but she set boundaries. She said what she would and would do, and good for her, because that's exactly what older people need to do. Hang on to things for dear life, hang on to that agency for dear life. My dad is 96 and he's still working. He's actually not happy right now because with the very unfortunate coronavirus situation, he needed to move from where he is and be somewhere else. And like a lot of people, it's taken away that sense of personal freedom and control and autonomy. He has certainly greatly influenced my own feeling about aging. I never considered anything that I would not continue to set new goals and meet new challenges. And my dad did a lot of new things after the age of 60. So I didn't really see any other path, but I've seen that there is a wide variety in how people view this later stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think one of the other things is that younger generations are facing is like, when do we allow someone to have agency or autonomy and independence? And then when do we kind of step in? And so that's always an interesting, challenging thing for families.
So you brought up the idea of different age cohorts, right? So people in their 50s are different than 60s, 70s, 80s. There's very distinct differences, which people don't think about a lot or talk about a lot, but in fact, you do grow and change tremendously in these later years, particularly if you can appreciate and recognize those signs. But my research showed that the sort of the point of departure where I think agency really begins to, or where the sense of agency that society courts us really begins to sort of play a part is when we are in our early 60s. I did research, qualitative research among a number of people who were, I called it baby boomers, close to 60, and asked them about this time in their life, what it was like for them, and what would be a few words to describe it. And it was remarkable, the similarity in their responses. And I came away realizing that this is what I would call an untime, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. The words that people use to describe this time in their life when they're in their late 50s or early 60s are unsteady, unstable, uncertain. It isn't just the political environment, which we know is making everyone feel, and has for the past couple of years, a little bit with the polarization in the country, a little less uncertain about where things are headed. It has a lot to do with the fact that there's no roadmap. They don't know what to head, and society hasn't really given people 60 plus a sense that it's okay to have a roadmap, that you should be thinking about what you want to do with your future. that leads to a lack of opportunities. It leads to people feeling that they're the only ones who have that sensation and those feelings of, what do I do now? Because not everyone has role models, like say I did my family. So that's the first point where people begin to sort of lose their sense of control, their sense of certainty, and sometimes just step away from thinking long and hard about what they might want to do, because it's just simply hard to go against societal expectations. So that's what I would consider the beginning. There actually can be an increase in feelings of well-being when women are in their late 60s and early 70s, because then they maybe have found, female friendships can become very powerful and very profoundly grounding and satisfying in later life, or it's grandchildren, or it's maybe continuing working in some way. So it's really around late 50s, early 60s that there's a time of uncertainty, and then people can find something. But is it what they really would have wanted to do? That remains questionable. There can also be a dip in well-being then when people get into their 80s, because that's when health impairments and some other issues can come into play. So there is some variability. The bottom line, though, is that we need to, Atulko one day had a wonderful quote in his book, Being Mortal, saying that we want autonomy for ourselves and we want safety for others. And we need to think, with the point you brought up earlier about adult children, thinking about their older parents by the time your parents are in their late 70s, 80s, and 90s. What can I do to ask my parent? What can I do to ask other adults, what do you want? And really value their autonomy as much as ours.
Yeah. So it's interesting, even in listening to you talk, I've heard I kind of go back to the age-friendly health systems,
Oh, yeah.
that model. Like I've heard you
Yeah.
talk about mobility being an issue, and then you just talked about what matters. And so
Yeah.
it's just interesting how these things kind of tie together. So
Well, yeah. And I just wanted, if I can elaborate on that for a second, Melissa, yeah, because I listened, the interview with Terry Fulmer was terrific. And I was, she talked about the 4 M's, which is so important. Talking to a healthcare professional about what matters, about mendacity, is that it?
mentation, mobility, and medication.
Yeah, right, exactly. So here's the thing, we need to give older people license to be able to ask those questions, particularly when you think about women who are in their 70s and 80s now, or in their 60s too. We're not socialized to say it's okay to stand up to authority, to ask a difficult question, to say, is that medication really okay for me? Or not dismiss a symptom as something that is just, oh, that's just age related. So we need medical professionals, we need family members, we need people in every way that interact with older people to say, what do you want, and give them permission for their voices to be heard and to honor those voices. So the encouragement needs to come both ways, to encourage those people to ask those questions and older people to have a sense of agency and say, this is what matters to me.
So and a couple of times I've even talked about the fact that there are a lot of different ways that, as you age, how your life can go. And so you mentioned kind of a roadmap. So what are some things that someone could do if they either wanted to develop more agency, or if you wanted to help a loved one to develop that? How could you create like your own roadmap?
Yeah. So those are well, that's one question that I can answer sort of 2 different ways. So just the idea of developing a roadmap. So there's actually some higher educational institutions now that are developing curriculum to help people in their 50s, 60s, 70s and up figure out what their next step should be. They're called encore type curricula. I don't know if GW has thought about something like this, but they're very powerful programs. Okay, yeah, to help people think about, where am I, and reflect on their lives. And part of this can be thinking about, how have I had agency in my life? And what were the decisions I made? Because those can make us feel so confident that then we can chart our own future. Now, these curricula are much more substantive than that, but a big part of it is just really stepping back and evaluating your life course and thinking about how you're going to use the remaining years that you have. But the other thing about agency, and I may have mentioned this earlier, but I said, we need to learn how to use our agency, we need to practice our agency, and then we need to hold on to it for dear life. And so one thing that I recommend is that people look within themselves and look all around them in examples of agency. They don't need to be really big, but for example, I'll give you some big examples. The Me Too movement. Agency is across the life course. So younger women and older women who have weighed in on the Me Too movement, because it affected many of them. That's a powerful, powerful example of agency. Nancy Pelosi, as I may have mentioned her earlier, ripping up Donald Trump's speech, basically her "don't mess with me" demeanor, that's agency. Jane Fonda demonstrating for climate change, that's agency. She said you have to put your whole body into something that you're passionate about, and that's what she's realized. There is no expiration date on agency. And you have women who are out there in the media, in the public arena, who are demonstrating agency. But it can also be really simple examples. Somebody who stands up to their children, somebody who says, or may say to their spouse, I really don't want to go on that vacation. I was sort of going along because, it seemed like a good idea, but I don't really want to go. Agency can be about saying yes as well as saying no. It can be standing up. I know one woman who talked about wanting to swim laps in her pool, and her grandkids would come over in the afternoon, and it was hard for her to say, it's my time to go swim laps. But she did it. And so, you can have pockets of agency. You can be a hard charging career person, but then you might have a tough time having agency with your physician or with your spouse or with your adult children. We need to really look at areas in which we have agency, in which we don't, why that's the case, and how we can practice it, and look all around us for inspiration. Since I started this research, I feel like I've developed more agency because I see the impact. When I asked one woman who had stood up to her adult children, because she said, this is what I want. It was tough for her. I said, how'd that feel? She said, it felt great. So I'm going to keep on doing it. Yeah. So agency begets agency. So we just need to practice it. We need to look at it. We need to be inspired, and we need to all we can to hold on to it until our very last breath. Agency does not have an expiration date. It doesn't end until the very, very end of our life.
Right. And this conversation is just around people that aren't experiencing any type of cognitive impairment. So just to be clear, because that complicates everything, and you have to adjust how you help someone maintain their agency, because
absolutely,
even in that situation, it's a delicate balance, and it's very, very difficult to do.
Yes.
So before we go, I appreciate you being with me today. Do you have any final thoughts or suggestions?
Yeah, I just like to, I know that, so my research is still continuing. It's multifaceted, and it will be coming out in different ways when it is complete. In the meantime, I'm really interested if anyone is listening, has ideas about agency that they would like to share, examples of agency, etc. Very interested in hearing from other people. So once again, this is an ongoing topic, and welcome hearing other points of view and great examples of agency in older women. So yes, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak with you, Melissa.
And so if someone wanted to get in touch with you, do you have like an email address they could email you, or a website they could look at? Or
Yeah, sure. So so just in terms of social media, I'm pretty active on Twitter, and that's at Cindy Cox Roman. My email address, I'd really welcome emails, is ccroman, ROMAN, at witconsulting.net. That's ccroman at witconsulting.net.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, and I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. Great to see you. Take care.
Thank you for joining me today for This Is Getting Old. If you'd like to know more, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you have any questions or a related topic you'd like to hear from me about, just let me know. Thanks.